Okay, I'll try to, maybe this is not a bad idea. The lecture is divided into 4 parts, as the fly sheet indicates. Look at the fly sheet. The first part is a general introduction to Aristotle. The remaining 3 parts are really the bulk of the lecture. The second part focuses on certain features of Aristotle's ethics, metaphysics, that bear upon ethics. This lecture is on Aristotle's ethics. But given that Aristotle presented a system, a perspective, a worldview, which is coherent and hangs together, it is useful to be able to relate them. So understanding Aristotle's ethics may depend in part upon understanding certain features of his overall philosophy. So this part, I'll select 3 important concepts in Aristotle and explain them and show how they relate. Okay. Is that better? Yeah. I will not repeat what I said. Okay, now I've had a chance to catch my breath. Okay, so I'll simply point out that Aristotle, the exception of Plato perhaps, is unquestionably the most important philosopher, at least in the Western tradition. And I'll try to show, as much as time allows, why he deserves this reputation, at least insofar as his ethics is concerned. So part 2, which I'll move to directly, focuses on 3 interesting and useful features of Aristotle's overall worldview and metaphysics, which I'll comment on very briefly in order to be able to spend the rest of the time available on part 3 and 4. Part 3 is an explanation of Aristotle's virtue ethics, and part 4 is an attempt to show why is it that Aristotle, who lived so long ago, is still taken very, very seriously, at least insofar as ethics is concerned. Aristotelian ethics, Neo-Aristotelianism, virtue ethics, is a very almost dominant theory in at least the professional ethics. I'll try to point out why this is so. Okay, so the 3 features that I want to explain very briefly about Aristotle's metaphysics. First, teleology. This comes from the Greek term telos, meaning purpose, goal. So teleology is the view that, at least the way Aristotle presented it, that everything that exists is striving to achieve a purpose, an end. في غائية, there is a purposefulness. So the world is designed in a certain way. And this is why Aristotelianism proved to be very conducive later on to the theologians in both Christianity and Islam, who found this very convenient, because if the world is designed, then there has to be a designer. We need not go into that. Okay, so his view is teleological in this sense. Maybe one way of looking at it is to consider very briefly what he says about the 4 causes. Take any object, anything that exists at all, in order to understand how it is that it became what it now is, we have to ask 3 questions. What is its material cause? So he gives the example of the statue, which I'll focus on. I'll use it myself too. If it weren't for the piece of marble from which the statue was carved, the statue could not have existed. And of course, we need the sculptor and his instruments, his chisel and so on, to impart upon this piece of marble the shape that the statue acquired. So that's the formal cause, as he calls it. which is what we normally mean by the cause. What is the factors that are responsible for causing something to come into being. And then also we have to identify the formal cause, because the sculptor could not have imposed upon the piece of marble the characteristics that he wished to impart on it if he did not have a form of what it is that he wants to produce. Is it a statue of Aphrodite, of a knight on horseback, or whatever? So the form is one of these causes. Finally, and this is Aristotle's contribution, if you wish, there has to be a fourth cause, the final cause. This is where teleology comes in. There must be a reason behind this whole process. So what was the purpose of producing this statue in the first place? Is it to commemorate a national holiday? Is it to put it in a garden or whatever? So and then he assumes, this is where his teleology comes in, that the final cause is always there. Things are for a reason. The world is full of purposes, and therefore it is a designed world according to rules and laws. All right. The second characteristic is the distinction between potentiality and actuality. I brought with me an acorn. This, you can find it on campus, at least during the fall. This is an acorn, baluta. Actually, the actuality of this object, it has a certain weight, volume, density. It tastes bitter. It's supposed to have nutritional values, and so on. So these are the properties that exist in this object as it now actually is. But that's not the end of the story. This acorn is potentially an oak tree. Okay. So the process of transformation from a state of potentiality to a state of actuality plays an important role in Aristotle's whole system, especially in his ethics. So the question becomes, if we want to apply this immediately to his virtue ethics, the question immediately becomes, how is it, or what need we to do as a society to make sure that this child, any child, will grow up to be a good person and a good citizen? So there are a number of assumptions that Aristotle makes about a human person, similar to the assumptions we make on an acorn, because we are familiar with how the acorn may develop to become an oak tree. So human beings are social by nature. This is an important feature of his philosophy and classical Greek in general. It doesn't mean that all children will grow out to be nice, good, decent citizens, but potentially the element is there. What we need to do is to provide an environment which will be nourishing and which will be supportive, and through example and habit and training, to instill in the child the appropriate virtues. So when the child grows up, he or she would be, as we say in Arabic, إنسان فاضل ومواطن صالح. These are the two, and they hang together. Okay, so that's a number of assumptions are built in. You can relate this to education and all sorts of other areas. He says human beings are educable. The level of education and the level we reach is determined by the potential. We cannot make of every child an Olympic swimmer or an accomplished concert pianist. The limit is set by the potential. So it has enormous applications throughout. The important thing for ethics is this: how essential it is for a community to provide the appropriate environment that will ensure that these character traits, what he calls the virtues, that are instilled in the individual and constitute his character, his or her character, we develop virtues and not vices. Both virtues and vices are character traits. They are predispositions to act in a certain way. If you are an honest person, if you have the virtue of honesty, you have a predisposition to tell the truth and not to accept bribes. And if you have the virtue of integrity and honesty. And the opposite is true. Right? So that sets the agenda, as it were. And this is at the very heart of virtue ethics. I may come back to this briefly in the main body of the lecture. Okay. So finally, the theory of the soul. Aristotle inherited and accepted Plato's teacher's theory of the soul. Plato had a tripartite theory of the soul. The soul is divided into three parts for Plato: the vegetative, the spirited, and the rational. The idea here is to be able to explain the difference between inanimate objects, plants, vegetables, animals, human beings. Now, Aristotle simplified it and divided the soul into two parts, the non-rational and the rational. Right. And what is important for us and for his ethics is that the rational part of the soul is what distinguishes human beings from other species of animals. And Aristotle, great biologist, used these categories to classify genus, species, differentiate, and so on. So human beings are animals. What differentiates them from other animals is the ability to to become rational. So rationality becomes the differentiator. It also acquires normative and tones. It is good, it is desirable, it's equivalent to excellence. And we have the very, very essential principle that he took for granted, that the non-rational must be subordinated to the rational. There is a sort of hierarchy. So reason plays a very important role in developing his ethics, politics, and other theories. Okay, so in Plato, just because you've, I think, read selections from Plato, in Plato we have the idea of harmony and symmetry. The republic divided into classes that correspond to the three parts of the soul. I'm not going to go into that. So Aristotle is building upon that to develop his own theory. So the important thing to keep in mind, therefore, is that if we are to be distinctively human and realize that which is unique to us, our excellence, we need to employ reason and follow reason. And we shall see how doing so may affect our views on ethics. All right, now I move to the Roman numeral 3, the virtue ethics proper. The first section under A, the general title is eudaimonia. Eudaimonia means in Greek, in a very general sense, a state of flourishing, of well-being, sometimes translated happiness. So that plays an important role in Aristotle's ethics. So this is, you came across this in the readings. He says, every action aims at some good. Human actions, especially those that are susceptible to moral judgment and evaluation, are intentional. People act voluntarily. They have an intention, a purpose trying to realize. And this purpose, this intention, I cannot really ignore you, sir, in the back. And if you're not interested in this, this is a lecture on ethics. Part of civility is to pay attention. Please, thank you. I wish I can ignore my students. I'm about to retire, but I have not learned to do that, so I'm not about to change. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the concept of happiness plays an important role. Here I want to say a few things about the theory of value. We have the ingredients of a theory of value in Aristotle, and the theory of value plays an important role in whatever theory of ethics you have. Putting it simply, a theory of value asks the question, what sort of things are good, are desirable, we want to have and have more of? Okay. And Aristotle added a very important distinction, which became crucial in developing any theory of value, the distinction between what he called intrinsic good versus extrinsic good. If I value A, and the reason that I value A turns out to be because A enables me to attain B, then the value of A is extrinsic, is outside of it. It's instrumental. It's valuable not because of what it is itself, but what it leads to. Okay, so why do I value B? If it turns out that I value B also because it leads me to something else, to make a long story short, Aristotle says there must be few things, there must be at least one type of thing which is desirable in and of itself, otherwise we don't have a coherent theory of value. And he identified this as happiness, well-being, eudaimonia. So ultimately, the value of all things valuable is because either they themselves produce the state of being, or they lead us to other states of experience or affairs that have this characteristic. A set of questions arise here, and I want to be brief in the interest of time. So is Aristotle, this is a question often raised, if the only things that are intrinsically good is the state of happiness, well-being, pleasure, call it what you want, is he a hedonist in the sense in which this term acquired later on? It's important to note out in this context that Aristotle tied this idea of attaining pleasure and happiness to his main objective of developing a virtuous character, his ethics of virtue. And he says that the pleasure accompanies, Rafi, goes together with virtuous activity. So the best way to become happy is to make sure that you are a virtuous person. Actually, this is the responsibility of the society as a whole, because by the time we are well formed, we have been the result of a process over which we may not have had full control. This is why in Aristotle the emphasis is on the obligation of the community to provide the environment that will nourish and sustain. As in the case of the acorn, you need the soil, you need moisture, then when it sprouts, you need sunlight, you need to protect it from the goats, and later on from hattab. So the process of development from an acorn to an oak tree is not simple or straightforward. It requires providing this supporting environment. And the same thing applies for his ethics. So the challenge is to ensure that we as a community, or any community, is fully aware of this responsibility and makes sure that provides a nourishing, sustaining environment that will instill and inculcate into the character of the individual those virtues, those predispositions to act in a good way. And so that becomes second nature. Okay, so let me move on to part 3, part B of part 2, the primacy of reason. Okay, I already noted in pointing out the importance of the fact that human beings are rational, that rationality is the differentia that distinguishes this animal human animals from other species of animals. Now he focuses on this and tries to emphasize the role of reason in controlling emotions and making sure that we grow up to be virtuous. Maybe an example would be useful here. Take the common emotion that all human beings have in varying degrees, the emotion of fear. Fear. If you are too fearful, which means that you will not take risks even when it is desirable and rational that you do so in order to achieve an end, if you become that sort of person, too fearful, that is not a virtue, that is a vice. This is cowardice. You are a coward. If you are not fearful when you should be, if you are rash and take risks that are not proportional to the ends that you are trying to attain, then that too is not desirable. That's not a virtue, that's a vice, rashness. So courage, which is the virtue, is a mean between these two extremes. So virtues are means between two extremes. One extreme in the direction of excess, too much, the other in the direction of deficiency, too little, and therefore we locate the mean, the virtue in the middle. And having explained this, Aristotle moves on to raise an important question, and this becomes a very distinctive feature of his approach to ethics and moral dilemmas. He asks the question, where exactly is the mean to be located? Now, if you want to look at it mathematically, on a scale from 0 to 100, the mean is at the point 50. Aristotle says, not necessarily. Determining where the mean lies depends upon perception, as he put it, which is another way of saying, depending on how you look at the situation. So his approach is situational, contextual. He cannot tell us ahead of time the extent to which taking risks is desirable or not desirable unless we know enough of the situation where we're called upon to act. So this becomes a very important characteristic of virtue ethics in general and especially of Aristotle's version of it. So his approach is contextual in this sense. Okay. Let me move on to the last part. Okay. The last part is not in the form of bullets. It's a text that explains itself. And I gave it the title, The Contemporary Relevance of Aristotle. Why is Aristotle's ethics still relevant to us in the 21st century? He was a much greater biologist, perhaps, than anything else he did. He was undoubtedly the greatest biologist of his time, and as Darwin pointed out from his point of view, that Darwin said that Aristotle is the greatest biologist of all times. Okay, but we don't study his biology. We study it, if we do, only as part of the history of science, because we have advanced considerably ahead of Aristotelian biology. But his ethics is still as relevant, as competitive, and as significant as it then was. Now, I will not give a lecture on that, but this is one way of seeing the difference between the discipline of philosophy and the natural sciences and so on. Why is it that those questions that were debated thousands of years ago are still not resolved? Is this a condemnation of philosophy that it's futile, falsafi, and so on? Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but think of it. So his ethics is very relevant. And let me, the last part of the lecture is supposed to give you a sense of why it is that it is still relevant in the contemporary world. If you go back to the fly sheet, not now, don't throw it away. At one point, when we're discussing the question of pleasure and happiness, not only do we as individuals have certain goods that we seek to achieve and values that we want to realize, but what Aristotle called practices, professions, these are collaborative activities. These are joint efforts. He gives the example of medicine and navigation, which during his time were fairly developed. Okay. So what is, and he asks the question, what is the good of medicine? What is the good of engineering? This is why he is very, very relevant to professional ethics. And you find professional ethicists referring to Aristotle perhaps more than any other philosopher in the last 50 years at least. Maybe one way of seeing this point, without going to great detail, is to focus on a distinction that Aristotle makes between the good of a practice which is inherent in it, which is internal to it, and the good of a practice or profession which is external to it. So he says, ask yourself, why do you want to become an engineer or a journalist or a doctor? What are you seeking to attain? What good is there for you in it? Well, if you want to become a doctor because you want to make money, that's not wrong. He was quite realist. تحسين علبك. But if this is your priority, if this is really your number one concern, he says you should have become a merchant. You can become wealthy much faster. This has changed now. Forget that. So wealth is a good, but it's an external good. External because you can realize it to a greater degree by becoming something else, by joining some other profession. You want to become famous? Well, Azim, it's a good motivating factor for people to do the right thing and develop skills and be of use if that will be very helpful to society. Aristotle has nothing against that. But he says if this is your sole concern or your priority or primary reason for choosing to become a doctor, you should have become a general, he says. Go to the army. Maybe the example of Pericles and heroes of his mind. So there are other professions, there are other ways of spending your life and realizing your ambitions that would serve that better. So the question remains or arises, what are the goods that are internal to a practice? What are those things that you can achieve as a doctor far better than anyone else can achieve when you look at curing, sustaining, helping, and so on? So that's another way of seeing the relevance of Aristotle. Now I want to focus on these two questions that, and I rely on the fact that I've explained it at some length in the second page of your fly sheet. I distinguish between two types of questions that Aristotle raises. First question, how do we determine what our obligations? What ought we to do? What is the morally right thing for us to do? That's an important philosophical question, and it remains throughout the history of ethics a very central question. The second question, also important but different, is how do we ensure or make it more likely that people will do what they ought to do? Having determined what our obligations are, what we ought to do if we are to act morally, the question now becomes, how do we get people to do what they ought to do? Now, it's obvious here that virtue ethics has something very significant to contribute here to the second question. If, to go back to the analogy with the acorn and so on, if we take seriously our obligations as a community, as a human community, to nourish and sustain those potentials in a human being that will produce these proper predispositions to act in the right way, the virtues, then that is the best assurance that we have a community where not only are we aware of what we ought to do and of our moral obligations, but we are the type of individuals that will do the right thing as a matter of almost second nature. Okay. So Aristotle's contribution is significant to this second question. Second question being, how do we get people to do what they ought to do? Of course, it is not something that can be achieved overnight. This is a problem we continuously face. If you want to tell a community, let's say, كيف نحارب الفساد بلبنان, that, well, the best way is to make sure that we begin now through our institution of the family, the school, more role models. If we identify what we need to do as a community to instill the appropriate predispositions to act virtuously in our children, that will take long time. بتكون نفسنا طويل. It is not something that can be achieved immediately. Okay. So there is a short-term solution. Put the criminals in jail or hospitals or whatever your fear of punishment. Produce sanctions against this kind of behavior so you can contain it. And at the same time, don't forget the essential question. If we began this process 50 years ago, we would be in a position to bear the fruits right now. Okay. So that's one way of seeing the way Aristotelian virtue ethics contributes to this. Okay. Now, it's important to distinguish between two types of situations where we need guidance, moral guidance. The first type is a classic moral dilemma. I have an obligation to tell the truth. I also have an obligation not to cause harm to people. So we have the example that goes all the way back to Plato. Someone asks you for a weapon, a knife that you've left with you, is his property, and you know that he's had a fight with someone and he wants to kill that person. Are you obligated to give him this property? Or he's asking you for directions to find a person who he will try to harm? Is your obligation to tell the truth? And so on. So we have conflicts of obligations. We are on our way to meet a person. We made a promise to meet that person. It's an important meeting, and we have incurred this obligation by voluntarily promising to do something or be at a certain place. And then on the way, we find that we are needed to help someone in a car accident, and no one else is around. So we have an obligation here to help a fellow human being who needs our help, and an obligation which we have already incurred by virtue of the promise we made. So how are we to realize which of these two competing obligations? You can produce even more gripping dilemmas. So a moral dilemma has this characteristic. There are several acknowledged obligations, things we ought to do, duties, and the way the situation is, we are unable to do all of them. So the question arises, what should override what? Okay. That remains to be a kind of dilemma. Now, how does virtue ethics contribute to this? Well, again, if we have become the sort of person who has the right virtues, the chances that we will do the right thing have increased. But there is no clear-cut formula that we can use here. Okay. One thing which I have not mentioned, which is very, very important in Aristotle's ethics, is what he calls the practical reason. The ability not only to reason quantitatively, mathematically, and to make right inferences from the right premises and so on, the ability to assess a situation, to see through it, which comes with the experience and with honest, serious, responsible efforts to plow your way through these dilemmas. Okay. So again, I don't have time to go over in detail what he calls practical ethics. The other kind of dilemma, this is now in text, how suppose we have cases where it's clearly wrong. Not all cases have this characteristic of a dilemma. Is it 12 وثلث من الكلاس ولا 12 ونص؟ 1 ونص. All right. Now I'll take 2 minutes. There are those cases where there is no problem in agreeing that this action is wrong. I give the example on the fly sheet of people who put on the market food or medication that are harmful and no longer useful in order to make money or to cut on their losses. There are so many things that people do all the time, and the question is not, is this wrong? We don't say, is it wrong for people to put on the market foods that are harmful to the consumer? Of course it is wrong. Okay. That we don't need the philosopher's service or anyone else's service to tell us that. The question arises, how is it that we have people in our community who do this sort of thing? And this again takes me back to what I said a minute ago. The solution would be to ensure that by the time the child becomes a grown-up and a citizen, he or she is not likely to do this sort of thing. This is the long-term solution. Okay. So the question becomes how to prevent this from happening. Okay. What does it tell us about a community that accepts these things? We know they're wrong. I'm maybe raising questions that are too sensitive, too contemporary, and I'm sure we all thought of that. So Aristotle has a lot to say about this. Do I have till 1:30 or 1:20? Okay, I'm sorry for taking time, sorry for coming late. Sorry?
There's nothing happening in the room after the lecture, so you can take another 10 to 15 minutes if you'd like, and I wasn't here to talk.
Oh, okay. Maybe I'll feel better if those who want to leave will leave. So, okay. All right. Thank you. So to clarify this last point I made, I distinguish between two types of dilemmas, if you want, two types of situations where we want to decide what we ought to do. The first are the typical types of dilemmas, and the answer, we saw how virtue ethics provides an answer. The second type, which I'm focusing on now, has to do with conduct, behavior, which is clearly wrong, but nevertheless is common. Right? And this I don't have to say much more to make you think of what situation you have in mind. We are in this mess. What would Aristotle say? Okay. Clearly there is something wrong, because having people who will do that sort of thing shows that the process of inculcating the proper predispositions and virtues have not worked at all well. The fact that people put up with this and at best they complain, ذمر, also shows that there is something deficient that should not be there. Okay. The question then arises, how do we deal with this? Well, to begin with, we put the criminals in jail. We make sure that these acts are identified and punished, but at the same time, we make sure that we review what we need to do as a community, looking at the institutions that we need to do. Normally, I would have students ask me questions at this point. There are certain things I did not cover, but if I would be happy to answer questions if you have any on any of these things. I usually leave. I think I did this time. My email address. It happens rarely, but you can email me, and I'll be very, very happy to discuss with you questions related to the lecture, although I'm not teaching CS right now, but I'll be happy to do that. Any questions you want, any comments you want to make? Yes?
How does one determine the right or moral course of action in a situation, say you have the same situation twice in a day, right? According to common understanding, the situation can be so different that actually how to determine the matrix of courage can be very different in situation one and situation two, right?
Okay.
You have the same situation and different people apply themselves to that situation. Can you have different outcomes? And how do you assess those outcomes?
Okay, that's a very good question. It relates to the point I made earlier. That Aristotle says that we determine where the mean lies depending on the situation. It's a situation ethics. So I cannot tell you ahead of time the degree of risk you have to take in order for you to be courageous and neither rash nor coward, or apply this to the other virtues. Okay, given that situations vary, it's rarely the case that two situations are identical. They may have very important similarities. So the answer, if I understand your question correctly, that Aristotle would give, we have to look afresh at every single situation. And we can use precedents. They do that in the judiciary. All right? But it's rarely the case that a precedent you appeal to in order to resolve a case is identical to the case you're dealing with. And this is what the good lawyers try to show. Whenever appeal to a precedent is not to their advantage. So it's built into virtue ethics, any situation ethics, any contextual approach, that we cannot eliminate entirely the subjective element. We can not invent a computer, a moral computer, to which we put facts and get an answer. Ultimately, we have to morally make and unmake ourselves every time we decide, depending on the degree of ambiguity and anxiety involved in the situation. In some cases, it may be clear-cut. In others, it is not. So if I understand your question correctly, there's no a clear answer that could be given, except to remind the questioner that the approach being situational, we have to look at each situation afresh. And while it may be enlightening and helpful to look at other cases that are similar, given that no two cases are entirely similar or identical, we must not become too bureaucratic and simply behave in this way. I don't know if I answered your question. Thank you.